Welcome to Esoteric Thoughts. Today we have Ed Dodge joining us. And Ed, I'm going to get straight into the question I've been waiting to ask you. Did God have a wife?
Yes, he most certainly did. We know her well. It's, the Heavenly Father is God, right? Well, the earthly mother was the wife of God. We know her well. We still call her Mother Earth. She never really went away. But in the biblical context, what does this mean? So I had heard this a couple of years back, that modern scholars talk about this character named Asherah in the Old Testament. It was the wife of God. But then they never really seemed to dwell on the question very much. But I thought that it absolutely shocked me, because I'd gone to church all growing up and no one had ever mentioned the wife of God to me, and no one had ever mentioned this character Asherah. But when I looked it up myself, sure enough, she appears 40 times in the Old Testament. The name does. And so I was like, what the heck is this about at all? Because this is just doesn't even begin to compute that there could be a wife of God. So I really wanted to understand. And so I just started digging into the research. And so just to point out that I didn't make this all up. The Hebrew Goddess by Raphael Patai is the one that really kicked off. He's a very, very well-respected Jewish Israeli academic. He's dead now, but he wrote dozens and dozens of books. PhD scholar, very, very renowned guy. That kicked off the conversation back in the 60s. William Deaver wrote this book, Did God Have a Wife? He's an American archaeologist who found some of the important artifacts about Asherah. So he began written a bunch of books about it. It was from the 80s. So this topic has been around for a little while in scholarship circles, but it hasn't really filtered out to the popular, the broader culture. And I didn't understand what they were talking about at all. It just didn't even begin to make sense. And so I started digging in, and what I really came to, the long story short, is that the historical Israelites that lived in when Israel actually was around as an actual nation from around 1000 BC, which is when they took Jerusalem, and to the year 586 BC when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem, which was an actual historical event. There was a real country there for 400 years, Israel and Judah together. That was not a monotheistic culture. They weren't Jews as we knew them. If we went back in time to that culture, they would not have known what we were talking about. If you mentioned being Jewish, they didn't have the Torah, but they were Israelites. They did call themselves Israelites, and they were a real people, but they were pagans. They were a polytheistic culture at that time. And the God of the Bible, Yahweh, was initially just another pagan god. And he came up in a polytheistic context. And you can see this in the verses all over the Old Testament. There's many, many verses that people have talked about for many, many years where God seems to be talking to other gods, where he talks about there being a divine council. I mean, there's all these different verses in the Psalms, in Genesis, in Genesis 2, Yahweh is talking to other gods. We created people, and they're going to be like us. So there's many different allusions to other gods in the Old Testament, not to mention the gods of the neighboring countries, which they talk about a lot. So it became apparent to me that, so in this pagan context, Asherah was the wife of El, and El was the heavenly father, the great sky god, the father of all the gods. And he's not just a Canaanite god. He's pretty much the god of the whole Near East. He's in Mesopotamia, they call him An. I'm of the opinion that these from the Indo-European pantheons are all related. So Mesopotamians, the Canaanites, which is just what we call the Middle East today, the Greeks and Romans, it's a common pantheon, but Egypt is different. Egypt is a different conversation, but there's a common pattern all the way through. So they've got the Heavenly Father, is the father of the gods. They've got his son is the god of thunder, is the king of the gods. So that's Zeus or Thor or Marduk. There's a bunch of them. There's Venus, is the love goddess, and she's very important, represented by the planet Venus. So that is, and then there's a mother goddess who is in the Canaanite tradition. She's Asherah, but she's got other names in other cultures. For the Greeks, it's Rhea, the mother of the Olympian gods. And so there's a pattern, and you can see that these gods are matching up from one to the other. And so El was the very old, very ancient Israel. They're the followers of El. That's what the name means, is or wrestles with God. But it's in the name Israel is Israel because they were the followers of El. They weren't Israel. If they were followers of Yahweh, they would have been Israel. I mean, scholars have recognized this for a long time. That Yahweh was a young God. He comes along much later. El had been worshipped for thousands and thousands of years, and he's part of this bigger pantheon. And then Yahweh comes along in this time period we call the Bronze Age collapse. So there was a complete like catastrophe from around the year 1200 to around the year 1000. It's the Greek Dark Ages. There's a 200-year period where there's a series of disasters, drought, famine, wars, earthquakes. They cause all the civilizations around the Mediterranean basin to completely fall apart. The Hittites in Turkey completely collapsed. The Egypt had been ruling the land of Canaan, but they're forced to withdraw back to Egypt. The Greeks, what is it? The older generation of Greeks that were there for the Iliad, they completely collapsed, and then they were replaced by the Hellenistic Greeks. But there's a 200-year period where there's complete breakdown in trade, governance, writing completely collapses, literacy completely collapses. And it's in this time period that they call the Bronze Age collapse that Yahweh first appears on the world stage. And this is like the oldest parts of the Old Testament. The Song of Deborah in Judges 5 is said to be one of the oldest passages, and it's from the oral tradition. There you see Yahweh coming along and being hailed in battle. This is also the same time period where Zeus and the Hellenistic gods, that entire Olympian pantheon, are also new gods. They're also invented at this same time period because they weren't. Zeus didn't exist in the Bronze Age. He's an Iron Age god. So you get these new pantheons, these new governments, new cultures that emerge that replace these old cultures. And so in the context of Yahweh, I believe that he's like a reform, like this is a reformer tradition. They are trying to, they're kind of like the abolitionists of the modern day. Like they are moral reformers that are preaching against these long-standing, what they consider sinful practices, but things that have been around for a very, very long time, like child sacrifice is one of the big things that they really are opposed to. Like, stop doing this. Yahweh says, don't sacrifice your babies. But that was actually something that they did. Ritual prostitution was something that they did. Like they celebrated female sexuality. They celebrated prostitution. The most popular goddess was a prostitute. Ishtar, Astarte, she's the queen of heaven. The goddess that King Solomon is worshiping is Astarte. That's Venus. She's Aphrodite, she's Venus. She's got a bunch of different names. And she was really the most popular one. She was more popular than the mother goddess. The mother goddess is respected, but the really popular one was her daughter. And so these are some pretty wild religious practices by our standards. I mean, the scholars call them fertility cults because they're all about nature and the cycle of life. And they celebrate the growth of plants. And these are farmer traditions, and they're celebrating plant growth. And they believe that basically sex makes the flowers grow, and the entire culture can't be having enough sex. And so they celebrate, sex in a religious context. That's why they celebrate ritual prostitution. And the Kadesha are the priestesses, and they're named in the Bible. And the word Kadesh means holy. And so the priestesses, even in the Hebrew language, are called the holy ones. And these are the ones that are overseeing all these practices all over the Near East, in Babylon, and in Turkey, and all over in Greece, and most definitely in King Solomon's temple as well. And so when the prophets of Yahweh come along, they are coming along in opposition to all this stuff. They want to end these practices. They don't like the priestesses. They have transgender priests as another big trope. Like they celebrated the trans people are all over the place. And Ishtar was trans. She's, I make man into woman, I make woman into man. And there's myths where she turns into a man because she's a goddess of love and war. So she would go into battle and she would sport a beard in battle, like Wonder Woman with a beard kind of thing. And so they had transgender high priests, and these are well documented right through Roman times. The Galli priest of the mother goddess Cybele was in Rome, but Cybele was an equivalent to Asherah, and it's an equivalent set of traditions. And they had these same kind of they're eunuchs, and we call them eunuchs, the men who are castrated. Some were castrated against their will to go serve in the palaces and things, But some men castrated themselves intentionally in service of the mother goddess. And they were the trans people of the era. They were like, just like today's trans people who want to change their biology and change their gender and would do these bodily mortifications, a sex change operation. They were doing it a long time ago. It was just a castration. That's what they did. And there's these poems from the Roman era that talk all about it, in the context of the goddess Cybele. But that's the same thing they were doing for Asherah. And so the Kadesha are the priestesses, and the Kadesh is the male version of them. And they're mentioned as well. There's 3 times that the male Kadesh are mentioned in the Old Testament in the First Temple period. And all 3 times it's when the prophets of Yahweh are chasing them out and like chasing them out of the land, and that they're talking about the reformers got rid of the Kadesh, who were the male temple prostitutes. And if you see the translation, Kadesh is the Hebrew word, but the English translation, like in the King James Bible or in modern English translations, always calls them temple sodomites. That's usually what they call them. But that's like a ritual homosexual. I mean, that's like what they were doing. And they were literally, you go to the temple and, it was good luck to give anal to the priest. I mean, you can only laugh. It's like Planet of the Apes, man. It's like, it's a mad world. It's just a complete opposite of how we imagine the world. But these were really old traditions that were thousands of years old at the time that, as we can say from history, they obviously got thrown out at a certain point, because we don't do it today. We don't have temple prostitution anymore. So there was a moment in history when, and it's not just one moment, it actually plays out over a very long period of time. But you see it beginning there in the Old Testament, and then it really kicks into gear when Christianity becomes a state religion of Rome. And then they really do shut down the temples with force, and there's also documentation from the early Christian era when they're shutting down the temples of Venus and getting rid of these transgender priests, and all these insults they hurl at them, at these effeminate men, and the prostitutes and stuff, and talk about how vile all these women were and all their ignoble behavior and immoral behavior. And these were these ritual prostitutes from these really, really ancient practices. And that was what Asherah and Astarte were all about.
So clearly Judaism at the time was polytheistic. What's
They
happened?
weren't Jews. Like, they wouldn't have used the name. So what happens is, so you've got this culture war playing out within the Israelite community between the Yahweh reformers and the people who want to maintain the traditional religion, which was Baal was the king. Baal was the incumbent king of the gods. Yahweh is his competitor. Yahweh is trying to like knock Baal down, and he wants to become king of the gods. But Baal was the old king. Yahweh is the upstart. And so it's like a political battle, because there's no religion and politics are one and the same in those era. So it's the followers of Yahweh are trying to defeat the followers of Baal. And they do ultimately, but this plays out the entire temple period until the Babylonians come and wipe them all out and send them into exile. And at that point, they'd still been polytheistic. They were still worshiping the Queen of Heaven. Jeremiah, who, as I was mentioning, is a prophet at the time of the Babylonian destruction. He goes and criticizes the women. There's this great quote where he goes and tells the women, this is your fault for worshiping the Queen of Heaven, who was Astarte. And they say, no, everything was great when we were worshiping the Queen of Heaven. Everything was fine. It was when you guys came along that brought about our destruction. And they have this big argument. And that's in the Bible. That's in Jeremiah. It's in my book. Anyway, but that's a great verse in Jeremiah where this is after the destruction of Jerusalem, criticizing the women for worshiping the Queen of Heaven, and the women shout him down. They say, no, fuck off. Like, everything was fine and didn't our husbands know what we were doing? That's what they say.
So why did they actually write the female deities out of the Bible?
So you see, it's my interpretation of it is, so what happens during the exile is, this is when they write the Bible as that we read today. The Torah that we read today is written during the exile in Babylon. Now they're taking old texts. There's old texts hundreds of years old that they are bringing together, and they're editing them and piecing them together, and they are writing new stuff at the same time. But the final version that we read today is definitely written in the exile, like after the destruction of the first temple. And at that time, they take the character of El and the character of Yahweh, and they consolidate them into one single God. And this is why you have two names of God in the Bible. It says God and the Lord. But in Hebrew, those are two different words. It's Elohim and Yahweh. That's because originally they were two separate gods that they get fused together. And to make the one Heavenly Father rule alone. Well, the Heavenly Father, if he's going to rule alone in monotheism, he can't have a wife. You can't have this female, and you can't have these priestesses who they didn't like anyway. Because the women had money, they had power, they had authority, they made money from the prostitution. The women kept the money. Like the women weren't giving the money to some man, they keep it for themselves. They had all sorts of power and authority within the community that the male, misogynistic, patriarchal, new reformers don't like it. So, and you see a very parallel thing happening in the Greek culture at the same time. They are also extremely patriarchal, and they also write a parallel set of myths that demonize women. So both cultures have a myth where the very first woman is the root of all evil. So in the Garden of Eden, it's Eve, it's the source of all of men's troubles. And in the Greeks, it's Pandora. It's a similar story. Pandora was the first woman. And the Greek golden age, the mythical golden age, was male only. And it's only when Zeus brings in Pandora to tempt men, and that she opens the box, opens the jar that releases all the evils upon the world, that, you know, evil exists now, and it's all women's fault. Both cultures are saying the same thing, that, you know, we can't trust the women, like they're out of control. We got to keep them restrained. We got to keep them in the back, locked down, and they can't be having this freewheeling sexuality. Part of it is paternity and imposing male birth lines. Like if you have maternal bloodlines, then it doesn't really matter who the women are having sex with, because you're not controlling for the seed. But if you have paternal bloodlines, if you control bloodlines by the father, then you do need to control the women's sex lives, and you can't be having them go out to the temple and getting, you know, whoever coming in there. They got to control that their sex lives are only for the appropriate men, and that's how you can control for paternity. Well, that obligates you to, like, you know, control your women, and so that's what we've been doing ever since, up until like the Industrial Revolution knocks things off its hinges. But for, you know, for 2,000 years, like they're really keeping women locked down pretty tight from like 500 BC going forward. It's like women have like basically no rights at all. And then for the 2,000 years before that, you can see in the progression of laws that women start out in the earliest law codes of like Mesopotamia, the women have quite a bit of rights. And with every progression of law codes over the centuries, you see the women lose bit by bit, lose their rights until you get to like 500 BC, which is when the Old Testament is written. At that point, they're like, women have no rights at all.
And in your book, you mentioned that the Bible tells us about the story of their divorce. Can you expand on that?
Yeah. So the ultimate, it's sort of, it's like a subtext of the Bible when you sort of recognize that the Israelites had these priestesses and had these traditions, and then you see them when you put all the stories on the timeline. You know, the Bible is not written in the order that we read it. Like some of the oldest parts, like Genesis, like first of all, there's two creations of the world between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. These are two entirely separate stories written centuries apart. People can debate which was written first, and it doesn't even matter. The point is they're two different authors and they're centuries apart. So there's a historical part of the Bible and like a mythological part of the Bible. The historical part of the Bible is in the books of Kings, which is where you actually see like the progression of all the events. And then when you can put the prophets up in their historical timelines as well, you see the progression of how like they're fighting against the women. So one of the earliest prophets is Hosea, and it's one of the oldest parts of the Hosea is he's after the Israel and Judah split into two different countries. So he's after King Solomon, after Israel has become its own nation. He comes up from Judah and tells the people in Israel all the bad stuff they're doing. And his famous part of his story is that his wife is a prostitute. His wife is Gomer, and she's having children with other men. And Hosea really does not appreciate that very much. And he wants to lock her down and like make her stop doing that. Well, presumably Gomer is one of these Kadesha. She's a priestess. She's not just a street prostitute, because there's a distinction. There's two different words for a street prostitute, like a brothel prostitute, and a priestess. Zona is the word for a brothel prostitute, and a Kadesha is a priestess. Gomer is presumably one of these Kadesha. I mean, she's married to the prophet, right? Like they're religious, they're holy people. And so when she's out there having these other babies, it's in a religious context. And that's why these names are very important. One of them is called, I'm not looking at the text, I can't remember all the names, but one of them is like not loved, translates as not loved, or not loved. The Yahweh says, I know. Basically, Yahweh disowns these kids, saying, you don't belong to me. But it's Hosea speaking as Yahweh and Yahweh. So it's like it's a very allegorical, it's very beautifully written, actually, really beautifully written chapter. And so this is pretty early on. It's like 8th century, 9th century. And you see it's the prophet, this prophet of Yahweh taking this priestess to task and saying, stop your festivals, stop your practices, stop your prostituting around, and only come home with me. You're only allowed to come home with me. It's worth pointing out, she never speaks. We never get to hear what her response was. We only hear him telling her what to do. We don't hear what she said in response. But anyway, they leave that bit out. And then as the story goes on, through the book of Kings, Asherah is also, the reason why she's mentioned 40 times is most of the time it's as an Asherah pole. An Asherah pole is like a totem pole, it's a carved wooden pole. It's a cultic object. It stood next to the altar of Yahweh or the altar of Baal. It stood next to the altar of the gods and in the temple. So there was an Asherah pole in Solomon's temple. And so one thing the followers of Yahweh would do is they would chop down these Asherah poles. And then those are the good kings, are the ones who would do these religious reforms, chop down the Asherah poles, smash the temples and the altars to Baal, and chase away or murder all the priests. But none of these reforms were very popular. And so as soon as that reformist king died, the next king, as soon as he would come back, he would be a pagan king, and they'd put the Asherah poles back up again. And the writers of the Bible complain endlessly that they went back to all their sordid pagan ways. So these pagan ways involve, like, the golden bull is one of these examples. The golden calf or the golden bull that is at Mount Sinai, that when Moses comes down from Mount Sinai and Aaron and the people have been worshiping the golden calf, this famous story. That's the symbol of El. That's one of these pagan symbols of the old religion, and that the followers of Yahweh want to stop them from doing the pagan stuff and just do this reformist stuff. Well, that wasn't the only golden calf. There was more golden calves. When Israel and Judah split, after King Solomon's son is Rehoboam, and then Jeroboam is the rebel, and they break off and makes the northern kingdom of Israel, the first thing he does is build 2 more golden calves, one in the south in the city of Bethel, and the one in the north in the city of Dan. And so Bethel, which means house of El, which is the town where Israel gets its name, where what's his name? One of the patriarchs, I'm having a brain fart, but anyway, who gets the name Israel, Abraham's son there, not Abraham, Isaac, and not Judah, but anyway, what I'm talking about. He gets the name Israel in the town of Bethel, because Bethel means house of El, and Israel, we were talking about that. So that's where they build a golden calf in Israel, in Bethel, because that's how they worshiped. He was the bull of heaven is one of the monikers that they use for the Heavenly Father. And that's a very old trope. Again, it goes, bull worship is like a very, very old thing. It goes back to Mesopotamia and other places. So the bull of heaven was the Heavenly Father. And so this golden bull represented El. The followers of Yahweh say, stop doing that. Stop having this El worship. We want you to worship Yahweh. And they say, and this is one of the things that they argue about it. They argue about it for centuries, until finally it gets resolved by external forces, because the Babylonians come and wipe them all out and send them to Babylon. And then it's when they go back, it's only in Babylon that they invent out of this whole theology of monotheism. They write the Torah, they write a bunch of the books. And then it's when the Babylonians get defeated by the Persians take favor on the Jews and are very, they give them funding, they give them support. and tell them that they can go back to Jerusalem to build the second temple. And that's when they go back, and that's when they become the Jews. That's when in second temple, if you went back in time, you would recognize what they were doing. Like they would have the Torah, they would have the Passover, they would have all the rituals that we are familiar with. Even though it'd be a very early form of it, we would recognize it, and they would be monotheistic Jews. Whereas in the first temple, they were still polytheists arguing about stuff within the polytheistic context.
On a personal note, can you share with the audience, given your journey through religion, given your journey through your research and writing this incredible book, how do you now see religion and how do you now see God?
All right. Yeah, that's a good question. So we were mentioning off camera that, I grew up going to church. My parents weren't super religious, but I did get a lot of church background when I was growing up. I was raised Protestant, but I also went to Catholic school. So I got plenty of church background. And when I was 18, I stopped calling myself a Christian, but it never made me an atheist. And I've been interested in comparative religion ever since, especially Hinduism and Buddhism. And my sort of thesis of what's happening in the world, like in the Western culture right now, is that Christianity is failing, slowly but surely, but that the alternative politically is no religion at all. It's a materialistic worldview where there is no spirituality at all, and they celebrate. So it's this neo-Marxist, neo-Maoist, neo-Jacobin, very secular worldview that's science. They say it's rational and science-based, but that they're very hostile to religion. And so Marxism, one of the defining characteristics of Marxism is that and Mao as well, is that they're hostile to organized religion, and they want to replace everything with the state and everything with a materialistic version of the state where there is no higher power. It's just man. It's just man's truth is what's going to prevail. I happen to think this is kind of a dangerous idea, and I happen to think that it has not ever worked out well so far. And I don't really have confidence that the modern day woke are leading us down a better path than the Marxists or the Maoists did before us. So I feel like we're caught in this collision course between reactionary. So Christianity is not giving up the fight, mind you. So the political forces of Christian nationalism are not going to go down without a fight. Like they're going to go down swinging, like no matter how it goes, especially here in America. Like white Christian nationalism is definitely bringing a fight to the table. But the other side is like intolerant and dogmatic and authoritarian in their own right, and become increasingly unnerving, the things that they're saying. Because I support trans people, I support Black folks, all of it, but like the extremists on the woke extremists aren't like making any sense at all. Like it's totally irrational, the things they're saying. It's a whole nother conversation. I tried to point out this history of trans people to trans folks. I was like, you guys are in the Bible. Like you guys are sacred and special and celebrated in the ancient world. Like shamans and high priests and like incredibly important. And nobody really cared because it was like in the biblical context and the spiritual context. And like, they weren't really interested in engaging the conversation. And so I kind of like stopped really, like, I'm not going to like bang my head in the wall endlessly when people didn't even like care. I think it's really interesting though that trans people were all over the ancient world and were really celebrated back then. And I think it's relevant to today's conversation. I've sort of come to this, my own sort of esoteric worldview. So I got to thinking a lot about, the mother goddess and the context of what was lost when, first of all, what did it mean to be worshiping the, Asherah and these other goddesses? And then what was lost when we got rid of her? And I started to notice all these parallels in other traditions. First of all, she's Mother Earth. That was like a big, shocking. They don't call her Mother Earth. They actually call her Lady of the Sea, Asherah. That's her title. But in those days, they were still flat earthers. They didn't really have the same context of the Earth as a globe floating in space the way we do. So for them, the oceans were the source of all life. But the oceans really just like the womb of Mother Earth. And they understood that all life came from the oceans, which is actually biologically true. Like some modern science does think that life on Earth emerged from the oceans. And so they refer to the mother goddess as the lady of the sea, that all life emerges from the salt waters. And so I just started to think about, what's missing. And when I noticed that all this stuff that they were doing in the temples of Asherah and Ishtar and Babylon was very similar to today's counterculture. It's like there's music and dance and psychedelic drugs and sex and gay people and trans people and nature worship. And I was like, wow, this is like today's counterculture. This is like me and my friends at a Grateful Dead concert, or at a drum circle or something, a bunch of hippies at a drum circle. And I realized that there's these connections, that everything the liberal left is fighting about today can actually be totally argued, seen in this context of a mother goddess, but that and that it's been missing from Western culture for the last 2,000 years. Like, we've persecuted women for centuries. They were burning witches in Europe for 400 years. 80,000 women, mostly women, were basically murdered for accusations of witchcraft. And who were these women? Like, they were poor women, they were isolated women, they were herbalists, they were midwives, they were women with pagan views, because the paganism never went away all through the Middle Ages Europe. Like, as much as the church dominated Europe, there was still paganism in the countryside. It never completely went away. The Asherah pole became a maypole, and the Asherah pole is similar to a Native American totem pole. It's drawn from the same set of traditions that probably go back to the Ice Age. That the Native Americans came over the land bridge from Asia with these totem poles, and these totem poles, they found them that are like 10,000 years old. Like, it's really, really old tradition to be making a totem pole. And that's what these Asherah was doing. So I think that these mother goddess traditions are really, really ancient. And I think that they speak to a part of the human experience that's been denied us in the West. There's no sacred feminine. There's no feminine divine. Women are not taught that they have these divine powers. Women's sexuality is totally demonized, and totally constrained. And so plant medicine, psychedelics, all these things are considered the devil's business, in a Christian worldview. In America, when the white folks discovered Native Americans doing peyote, rituals and things, the immediate response was to like put an end to it. Like, the white folks didn't like it, didn't trust it, didn't want them doing it. And in Mexico, in the 1800s, Mexico, the Mexican Catholics hated marijuana. Like, they had marijuana there for a long time. The indigenous people totally embraced it, but the Mexican Catholics hated it because it's all, again, this plant medicine and midwifery and indigenous stuff that speaks to all this non-Christian worldview that, the Christian worldview is quite intolerant of, a very strict Christian worldview is intolerant of other belief systems. They're totally intolerant of Native Americans. This is why we were so genocidal and cruel and genocidal to them, which is like a great sin that still needs to be corrected, along with the sins of racism. Like, these have not been fully addressed and need to be. So I think there's been this hole in Western culture where the mother goddess used to be. She never completely went away. The Virgin Mary was there all along, but she was very clearly a demoted, like, one of the Protestants love to talk about the Virgin Mary just being like a pagan goddess. Like, they're right, except that the Protestants got rid of her even more. Like, the Catholics had already demoted her and told her she's not a goddess. She's got all the titles and tropes and imagery, but she's not really a goddess. The Protestants are even worse. They get rid of her altogether. Like, they're not even going to pay attention to the Virgin Mary. So I think that we need to have a new Reformation and bring about the mother back. And, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. I think that the collision course we're right on right now is between this atheistic worldview and a reactionary Christian worldview, and that it spells trouble for everybody.
Ed, thank you for your time today. Thank you.